Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doug Kinchy. I'm the director of the Kaufman Interfaith Institute at Grand Valley State University. On behalf of the Institute, we welcome you to the Grand Dialogue in Science Religion, exploring the theme, Healing Our Earth. The Grand Dialogue is an annual program of the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, and it is an interinstitutional, interdisciplinary, and interfaith approach to science and religion. As a component in our 2021 Year of Interfaith Healing, we are exploring at the Grand Dialogue this year one of the sub-themes, Healing Our Earth. As we begin our time together, we pause to acknowledge the land on which we gather. We recognize the people of the three fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, the Potawatomi, peoples who welcome this land that we are gathered. The Three Fires people are indigenous to this land, which means that this was their ancestral territory. Every university, congregation, institution, business is a part of and is doing their activity in West Michigan, built on this native land. We are guests on their land, and one of the ways to protect the relations is with acknowledging the histories and traditions of these people who organized here first, who are still here and who have tended the land, as always, from which we can all learn. This acknowledgement is an important first step, and only a first step, in acknowledging and seeking to engage in the important work of social justice and equity. Once again, welcome everyone to this afternoon's webinar. A couple of housekeeping reminders. Please make use of the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. Should you have a question, feel free to send that question in for our panelists. The moderator will seek to integrate the questions into the discussion. Also note the chat tab on the bottom. This will be used throughout the event to share links and resources from our panelists. Be sure to check that throughout our time together. At this point, it's my privilege to introduce to you the moderator for this first session, George Hartwell. His career began as a mortgage banker, then returning to school to study for ministry, and following ordination in the UCC denomination, George served the Heartside ministry for 14 years. While still serving in the inner city, he was elected to city commission and then served as our mayor for 12 years. He represented the U.S. mayors at the Paris Climate Task Force and has served on the Great Lakes Water Quality Board. Along with 23 other governors and tribal leaders, George was on the President Obama's task force on climate resilience and community preparedness. Under his leadership as mayor, Grand Rapids received the Green City designation and was named the most sustainable city in the nation by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for mid-sized cities. Now retiring and doing his bit for the environment, each spring tapping maple trees on his acreage for his annual maple syrup crop, and in the winter participating in non-polluting activity of cross-country skiing. We're pleased to welcome George Hartwell as our moderator for today's panel, and thank you for being with us. Now I turn it over to George to moderate our first panel.
Well, thank you, Doug, and good afternoon, friends. We're so glad that you have decided to spend the Sunday afternoon with us today for what I know is going to be a very rich conversation on a Christian perspective on creation care. We have three wonderful panelists who have been thinking deeply about these matters, and in just a couple of minutes, I will introduce them and then ask each to to expand a bit on that introduction, and then take 5 minutes or so to lay out her or his perspective on the subject matter for us. You know, I'd prepared some opening remarks for this webinar, and I threw them out after yesterday and Friday, spending my time in a most remarkable virtual conference on traditional knowledge presented by the International Joint Commission. Now, the speakers for the conference were all tribal and First Nations people from the United States and Canada. And I thought that the relevance to the conference of that conference to this afternoon's presentation was the nature of the relationship between humans and the whole of creation that each of these speakers affirmed. One said, in reference to the plants and animals, they are relatives, not resources. She said there's an inherent hierarchy between people and the rest of nature in the English language that doesn't exist in indigenous languages. And it struck me that that Christian doctrine and interpretation of Scripture have sometimes magnified that hierarchy. We place humans above nature. We put nature at the service of humankind. We are the thinking, feeling beings, and the plants and animals are insensate, and they're there for our taking and for our use. But indigenous people see a reciprocity in the web of life. They see plants and animals as beings from whom we can learn. Even the water, the flowing rivers and the placid lakes and the mighty oceans are part of this living web. Another speaker at the conference spoke of inquiring of the water, praying with the water. And he urged us as non-native participants to shift the narrative and understand the healing nature and the hopeful spirit of the water. I believe that all nature is sacred, is created by God, and moreover is infused with the very spirit of God. And yes, we have a responsibility to protect and care for this sacred web of life of which we are a part. But also we have an obligation to walk humbly in nature, to learn from nature, to listen to God's voice speaking through the fish and the birds and the animals and the trees and the plants and the water. They are relatives, not resources. Our first panel speaker this afternoon is going to be Steve Bouma-Prediger. Steve is the director of the Environmental Studies program at Hope College. Following Steve will be Sister Damien Marie Savino, Franciscan, who is Dean of Science and Sustainability at Aquinas College. And then the third speaker is Chris Elisara of the Ormond Center at Duke Divinity School and director of the World Evangelical Alliance Creation Care Task Force. With that, Steve, let me turn the panel over to you, please.
Okay. Thanks, George. Appreciate that. In my book, For the Beauty of the Earth, Chapter 7, I outline 10 reasons to be an earth keeper. And we don't have time to go through all those 10, but in reviewing them, it struck me, I asked myself, which ones are most persuasive to me? Which ones identify how my faith informs my approach to creation care, which is the question before us. And there were a number of those that I thought, yeah, that's why I have spent 30 years of my adult life looking at the intersection between Christian theology and religion more generally, and environmental issues. The first of those reasons I call Poor and Oppressed Unite, eco-justice reason. A 1987 study, Toxic Wastes and Race in the United States, one of the authors of that study, and I quote, says, the racial composition of a community is the single variable best able to explain the existence or non-existence of commercial hazardous waste facilities in that area. Racial minorities, primarily African Americans and Hispanics, are strikingly overrepresented in communities with such facilities. So Charles Lee and others coined the term environmental racism. And there's environmental sexism and so on. So what this reason for caring for creation says is basically we should care for creation because various forms of oppression are connected. They're of a piece. Certain so-called social justice issues intersect with certain so-called environmental issues. As a Christian, I'm concerned about, among other things, justice And so this for me has been a persuasive argument or reason why I'm an earth keeper. Another one, we're all in this together. The community of creation argument. I just spent a class this past week with a couple of students reading Aldo Leopold and discussing his work.
Steve, you just went muted.
Sorry, I didn't hit it. Okay. All right. So the second reason why I feel my faith informs my work, creation care, is again the argument I call we're all in this together. Community of creation. All creatures are bound together in such a way that their flourishing is interdependent. So we should act in a way that enhances the life of the whole community. Aldo Leopold, famous line from his book, Sand County Almanac, all ethics rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. So his definition, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and it's wrong when it tends otherwise. Or John Muir, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. That's the biblical view of creation and this interconnectedness and interdependence. And so for me, one reason I, as a Christian, care for creation is that we are, in fact, all in this thing together. Another reason is simply God says so. I have a favorite verse, Genesis 2:15. I call it Chicago police car verse because on the side of every Chicago police car, it says, serve and protect. And they are quoting from the Bible. To avad and shamar, that's our task as humans, according to Genesis 2:15. The Lord God took the Adam, the human earth creature, put us in the garden that is the earth to serve and protect. It's hard to argue with that when you say that's from the Bible, that's our calling as people, as humans. And there's all kinds of other texts in the Bible. In Leviticus, we're commanded to give the land a Sabbath, a rest. The Sabbath is not just for people, but for the land and the animals. So God says so. The divine command argument is another, I think, persuasive and compelling reason. And then in Genesis, we know we're created in the image of God. We're meant to represent God and rule as God rules. So that's what I call the God's concerns are our concerns argument, or the image of God argument. And we know what it's like what we're supposed to do to image God in the Old Testament, especially in the New Testament, texts like the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, or John 13. Being an image bearer of God means imitating Christ and being concerned about all creation. If God's concerned about all creation, which clearly God is, then we who call ourselves Christians ought also to be concerned about all creation. And the last reason in my, it's not the only other one, but the last argument that really, probably the deepest argument for me is what I call for the beauty of the earth, to use the title of an old 19th century hymn, the grateful heart argument. It's pretty simple. It goes like this: care for creation is a fitting response of gratitude for creatures like us who experience God's bountiful and gracious provisions. We should care for creation because grace begets gratitude, and gratitude begets care. There is this kind of phenomenology of grace and gratitude. This whole creation is a gift. And what more appropriate, more fitting response for those who acknowledge it as a gift from God than to care for it as a way of saying thank you. I'm from the Reformed tradition. I also am an evangelical Christian, and John Calvin refers to creation as this most glorious theater for which we should praise God. And one of the catechisms in my tradition, the Heidelberg Catechism, talks about guilt, grace, and gratitude. It ends with gratitude. We are who we are. We serve God because it's a way of saying thank you. So What drives the Christian to love and obedience, quoting one scholar, is thankfulness. All of our moral life is designed to be with a characteristic note of joy, a way of saying thank you to God. And that includes, I would argue, for me at least, caring for creation. That's all for now.
Thank you, Steve. I wish we could stretch this time out and hear the other 5. If the first 5 were that good, I wonder what the second 5 would be. But if you're curious about that, folks, please note that in the chat there we've put a link to Steve's work, and you can go there and read it for yourself. Now, let me turn next then to Sister Damien and Savino, and ask you please to give a little more fulsome introduction than I provided, and take your 5 minutes or so.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Steve, also for that wonderful presentation. I feel a lot of harmony between our two approaches. As George said, I'm the Dean of Science and Sustainability at Aquinas College. And I think in these past 10 years or so of my career, I've spent a lot more time working at the intersection of ecology and faith. And now today I'd like to focus on Laudato Si. I'm a Franciscan and in the Catholic tradition, and we have that encyclical from Pope Francis. So I wanted to focus on that, but also to let you know, I have done a video called Creation with Salt and Light TV, a Catholic TV station in Toronto. And in that video, we look at 6 reasons why we should care for creation. So if you go to the Salt and Light website, you can look at that, and it might be something. We've used it for different groups where you meet for 6 weeks and watch each half-hour segment, and there's a study guide to go with it. I won't be focusing on that today because I did want to take a Laudato Si, but maybe in the Q&A, if it comes up, I can say a little bit more. So I would say I'd like to give you 2 big reasons from Laudato Si why we should care for creation, and then look at St. Francis as an exemplar for us, which is very central to the document as well. So first of all, Laudato Si, and this is what it looks like if you want to get a copy of it. It's also online. It came out in 2015. We're celebrating the 5th anniversary of that right now. And it's part of the Catholic social teaching. And it's the first social encyclical we have in the Catholic Church to focus entirely on ecology. John Paul II and Benedict XVI also spoke about it fairly extensively, but this is the first one whose sole focus is ecology. And it's addressed to every person living on the planet, so not just to Catholics, not just to Christians. It's an effort to bring the whole human family together. And it's not telling us what to think, but more inviting us into a serious moral conversation about an urgent issue of planetary importance that the Pope wants to bring to us. So the big reason why we should care for creation is it's a matter of love. And I think charity is at the heart of the Church's social doctrine. And so it's very important that it be a principle of our micro relationships. So with our friends, our family members, within small groups, but also of our macro relationships, so economic and political ones. And all of these, the micro and the macro, are addressed in Laudato Si in different chapters. And I don't have time today to go into that. But the whole goal of the document is to move us more toward a civilization of love. And I'd like to take just a moment to talk about the subtitle. So the subtitle is On Care of Our Common Home. And when I first read this, I was very struck by the use of the word care. And I later Googled it. It's used 38 times throughout the document. And that was deliberate. And the word care actually comes from the Latin cogitate, so to think and to ponder. And I think that etymology brings a kind of contemplative undergirding to the word, that our care, our safe giving, our nursing and healing of creation is grounded in an attentive listening, a contemplative listening to creation. Cardinal Turkson, who is one of the leaders in our church who was closely involved in preparation of the document, highlighted this focus on care. And he says, whereas talk of stewardship implies a relationship based on duty, the notion of care taps into something deeper. When one cares for something, it is something one does with passion and love. We cannot love God when we do not appreciate or care for what God has made. This is what the Pope wants us to understand. Whatever you call the Pope's message, he says, it is essentially an invitation to make our love for God show in what God has made. So, and I think it's very important the Pope emphasizes that ecological concerns are actually core to the Christian faith, and they should never be considered as alien to Christianity. And the heart of his message about how we do this is what we call integral ecology, which is what I would say is kind of the central message of the document. And so what is integral ecology? Well, in paragraph 66, he says, human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely intertwined relationships: with God, with our neighbor, and with the earth itself. And so God, neighbor, and earth, when those are in right relationship, that's integral ecology. And so integral ecology is kind of like the marriage of human and natural ecology. And it's ultimately about reconciliation of those relationships and reestablishing the interior connections that are necessary for sustainability, not just exterior initiatives, as good as they are, and they're very good, but the ecological conversion that's necessary within ourselves so that we can truly hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, so that we can recognize the intrinsic goodness of creation that Mayor Hartwell so emphasized at the beginning, that creation has value in itself and not just for its instruments of goodness, not just for what we can get from it. And also that in a Franciscan sense, that creation points beyond itself to a creator. And so that leads me to my third point. How do we know how to live integral ecology? Well, the Pope points us to St. Francis of Assisi as the exemplar par excellence. And so for St. Francis, all creatures lead him to God. And with them, he praises and dialogues with God. And I would say Francis loved nature because he first loved God. So Sir Brother's sun is beautiful and radiant because it bears a likeness of you, Most High One, as he said, and it says in his beautiful canticle. The moon, the water, the wind are our sisters and brothers because God is the one who has made them. Excuse me. Francis basically praises God in all creatures, and this is why Pope John Paul II proclaimed him the patron saint of ecologists. And so he's setting an example for all of us, and it's not just some theoretical example, but it's a very concrete example, and how our contemplation of creation, our relationship with creation as brother and sister, doesn't exempt us from our responsibilities in the world. Actually, it compels us to be more committed to caring for creation. And so we need to live this way of love and care in all spheres, in the public and private realms, in poverty, in abundance, with the animals, with sister water, brother wind. So we praise God through all of that. And so I think just to end with this quote from the document about St. Francis. If we approach nature and the environment without Francis's openness to awe and wonder, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on our immediate needs. By contrast, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously. So I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Damien. And before I go to Chris, though, we do have one question from the participants for you, Sister Damien. And if you could take just a moment to briefly respond to the question, what was the position of the Catholic Church on environmental action before Laudato Si? And was this, that is the encyclical, was it a significant turning point for the church?
Well, as I think I mentioned at the beginning, for the past several popes have spoken about care for creation a lot more than we had before. And so even Benedict XVI was actually called the Green Pope in the media for a while. So, and in the beginning of Laudato Si, Pope Francis actually in the introduction, he quotes each of them, even going back to Paul VI. And he quotes, so he's building on what they've done, and he makes that very clear. And yet I would say it's a kind of a both and, because he does give a whole increment further in terms of what our responsibility is. First of all, by devoting a whole encyclical to it. Second of all, by adding in that paragraph 66, human life is grounded in our relationship with God, with one another, and with the earth itself. I've never heard any pope come out and say that so explicitly. And I think that's what we would call in the Catholic Church a theological development. So it's just adding another increment, a punctuation point on it. Then he also has a lot in the later chapters on particular initiatives, economic, political initiatives that I think are probably an increment beyond, but still it's inconsistency with what has come before, but a significant punctuation point on it. So.
All right. Thank you very much for that. And let me note as well that the creation DVD that Sister Damien referenced, there is a link as well on your chat. And I want to again encourage people to use the Q&A function. If you're new to Zoom, down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see something that says Q&A. You'll click on that. It'll open up a box. You type in your question, and then you hit return, and we'll get the question and try to pose it. Chris Elisara comes next. Chris, would you give us just a little more background on yourself, please, and then take 5 minutes or so to make your comments.
Thanks, George, and thanks for the others that have spoken. And I hope I can add something of interest to the conversation. And I will add that through my work as a practitioner. So I'll just say a little bit about the WEA Creation Care Task Force. So the WEA Creation Care Task Force serves the global evangelical community. And we are a historic organization that has over 129 national alliances in countries around the world. And we serve around 600 million members. And my responsibility directing the task force is to try to help us take what we believe, take what we understand, and act on it. And so I'm going to make some comments as a practitioner and somewhat as a movement builder. So adding on to what's already been said, I'll just say a few things that I think about. And I think they cohere with the theme of this discussion. And that is, the first thing is science and faith and how that interacts. Because what we do to care for creation will be informed by science. And understanding that is very important. And how we relate to it is really important. And so there's a few things I want to say about that. One is, that science is highly privileged in our society, and it's necessary for our lives, but it's a human production. And so it has influences and forces on it that drive in particular types of ways. And so we need to consider that when we work with science in creation care as a Christian. And I think the most important things for us is, getting good science. How do we get the good science, first of all? So there's an insider concern issue in the production of science and all the forces I mentioned on it. So how do we get the good science? And then secondly, the relationship of science to other forms of knowledge. It's a form of knowledge. And there's other forms of knowledge. So when I do my work, I'm always kind of trying to make the science translate into care and action, and it's applied. And so thinking through those edge issues is always the issue for me. And it's a relationship issue. And I think the edges are on other areas of knowledge, like ethics, ethical knowledge. So how do we make scientific and creation care actions that are just and ethical, as Steve mentioned. They're always on the edge of economic issues and economic science, as it were. There's always on the edge of politics and decisions that got to get made. So how do we make those types of decisions? So those are things I think as Christians working in creation care need to kind of work the field of knowledge, including science, to advance, and being adept in all those and contributing to all those. Secondly, I think today, I think we have moved into a context of doing creation care and doing science that is a new context for us. I think maybe not completely new, but it's advanced in its development. And that people talk about a post-truth world. So there is issues that we confront to act, to care for creation in particular types of ways in this post-truth world. And that comes down to, I think, questions like whose truth is accepted, whose truth are we going to act on, the blending of, what we understand now, faith as a truth, ethics as truth, and science as truth, and how do we move that forward in this post-truth world? And I think the biggest concern that I have is, how can we move into the ways that we need to move in this hyper conflictual post-truth world, saying this is truth and this is how we need to move to care for creation. This is how communities need to go. These are the actions we need to take. And that is contested, and how do we break through that? And my concern is, how do we derive that? Secondly, the third thing, and I'll just mention other areas of interest in science that I would say that we don't normally think about as Christians in creation care. So I'd like to expand some of the areas of science that I know the WEA, we're trying to think through and add to the way we care for creation. So I would say areas in behavioral psychology is an area of science I think is very important for us to understand, work in, and apply to how we care for the creation. So behavioral psychology, there's an app out now, is really popular, called Noom. It helps people make decisions and act, in their own best interest of their personal health. That's a behavioral psychology application to doing something good for a person's, health. Something along those lines for creation care may be helpful in the future, but that's the area of, behavioral psychology I'm thinking of that may help. Economics. Economics is something we need to really think through and understand and work in the context of caring for creation in such a way that it coheres with the ecological integrity of creation. And so there's an economic thinking happening right now called donut economics. Donut economics is something I think, we should think about because it's basically saying, let's make sure that our economic systems work within the boundaries, the ecological boundaries that science tells us we need to respect. And we need to connect our economics with that ecological boundary. So this donut economics is helping us do that. And it's happening in cities around the country. So that's another example of science. And I'll add to that urban planning, urban design, and engineering. Now, when you were introduced, George, you got great accolades for the way that you helped Grand Rapids become a green city. Now, that didn't just happen because, we dreamed about one day. No, it was informed by science, engineering, urban design, planning, and you made the city, more coherent with the ecological systems. And I think the Christian community needs to explore and embrace those aspects so we can make the places that we live in cohere better with our ecological systems. So that's an area of science and creation care that I think we should explore, and we do in the WEA. And the last thing I'll say is we need to also think about this new, I'll say it. I mean, I think we have created a digital world. And I think we have a natural world. We may have multiple worlds, but one of the worlds that we definitely have is a digital world. And there is an economics in the digital world. There is an ethics in the digital world. And I think we need to think through what the relationship is with the digital world and and natural creation, and think through some of the implications of that very, very carefully, using some of these other areas of knowledges that we have, theological knowledge, ethical knowledge, and so on. So I'm just putting on the table some things to open the conversation a bit more from a practitioner movement kind of perspective. So I will end my remarks there and turn it back to you, George, and the conversation amongst us and the listeners.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris. And let me just poke around a little bit on one of the points that you made. As you talked about economics and the whole field of economics, economic theory, economic practice, and how that plays out in a ecological arena. I know that you and I were both in Paris at the end of 2015 at the UN Framework Conference on Climate Change. And at the same time that we were in meetings up in the northwest or northeast side of Paris, the major corporations of the world were meeting over on the west side of the city at another conference center. And as we understood it, they were planning for and making their commitments to one another for how they were going to be involved in implementing whatever came out of this the Paris Accords. I think my question for you and for all of us to consider is: do we see evidence today that the corporate world is paying more attention to ethical matters and in particular to environmental ecological concerns?
I'd like to hear other folks, comments on this, but I do believe that things are moving in this direction. Maybe not as fast as we would like, but it's definitely moving in a couple of different areas. I'll just point out. One is in the area of impact investment. So investors who are ethically informed, both from a religious tradition or not, are making a difference with their investments and with their money. And so Anglican Church has made statements, or actually not made statements, they've actually pulled out of investing in carbon investments. And other faith groups have done the same. Other institutions have done the same. Now, that is good in the sense that it said that is not an investment we want. And now they're looking for constructive, faith, consistent investment to move into a new post, carbon intensive economy. So I think that is happening, from the investor side. But I think you also see movement in the corporate side. So the electrification of transportation and transportation system, companies are making decisions that they are no longer going to produce, engines that run on gasoline. It's going to transition to electrical vehicles. Entire fleets and companies are making this type of decisions. So that ripples through the economy. And then there's many other companies that are thinking through this as well. So I think we're in a transition time. And the question for me is, can we accelerate? And also, can we make sure it's inclusive of everybody, including folks not only in the US in terms of inclusivity, but in terms of internationally. So we work in the clean climate or the clean energy transition that's happening now, and making sure that countries in Africa and Asia are not left behind. And so we work on that. And we're actually meeting at COP26 to do the Global Evangelical Clean Energy Summit to work on this energy transition, clean energy transition for everybody.
Well, that's very encouraging. Steve and Sister Damien, let me open up for comments that either of you wish to make on this too.
Yeah, just briefly, donut economics. I'm studying that with an economics colleague and a couple students right now, Chris. Tim Jackson's book, Prosperity Without Growth, is one you ought to take a look at, one we all ought to take a look at. How can we have prosperity without growth? Traditional neoclassical economists say, and Jackson's a very good economist who says it's precisely the direction we need to head. In response to your question, George, Chris has already mentioned a couple things that immediately came to my mind, as well as evidence that we are in fact moving as a society and culture in the right direction. Electric vehicles, look at the statements that have been made by major automobile manufacturers in just the last couple of years. And divestment, colleges, universities, denominations divesting of their endowment funds in companies that are fossil fuel companies that produce a lot of carbon. So that's another example. The real question is, are we doing that fast enough? Because there are certain thresholds, of course, that we're worried about, that window of opportunity we have to act is closing, and we're not making those changes fast enough in order to avoid some of these ecological thresholds.
Yeah, thank you. Well said. I would just add, I mean, I think in the whole idea of the circular economy, and I know Kate Rayworth was invited to various talks. The Pope had something called the Economy of Francesco, where he was trying to look at alternative economies. And it was a weekend that occurred it was supposed to be last spring, but it occurred this fall, and partly in Assisi and partly online because of the COVID, where they were entertaining ideas for different economies and how do we get this thing moving faster. And there is also the Laudato Si Action platform. You might want to go to that website. That's basically a 7-year plan. Say you want to be a Laudato Si business, or a Laudato Si agribusiness, or a Laudato Si university, or a Laudato Si family, even on the micro level. We're working right now, and I'm on some of the groups that are strategically planning this. There would be like a 7-year commitment for how to do this, with concrete goals, in some of them about economics, energy, and water use. So trying to get concrete and make it a 7-year sort of pilgrimage toward this, so that we don't keep putting it off too, because I think we have a lot of good movements, but we've got to keep the thing moving. Are we doing enough fast enough? To go back to Steve's question. But I do think, and the other thing too, is the interior motivation that's needed to make this happen. And I do know there have been some I think the heads of the major oil companies actually met with Pope Francis several times over the past 2 years, in light of Laudato Si, to talk with him in a private setting about what they want to do, and to be able to have a place to brainstorm that's safe, and to try to make some new ways forward. So I found that very encouraging to know that was going on.
Yeah, thank you. And we do have a question from one of our attendees now that is posed to all the panelists, and I think stimulated perhaps by your comments, Chris, on entering a post-truth world. Do each of you see a crisis of truth in both science and faith? And if so, what is the path forward? I'll throw that out for whoever wants to grab a hold of that question first.
Wow.
I smiled when you mentioned that, Chris. I wrote a paper for my denomination's Theology Commission on precisely this topic over the last year, since I do work in what's called postmodern philosophy in theology. It's a huge issue. It's this issue of whom do we trust, and suspicion, the suspicion that we have as generally about all kinds of things, including institutions, and now even science, suspicion, who can we trust? And I deal with this a bit, Brian Walsh and I, in our book, Beyond Homelessness, Christian Faith and Culture of Displacement. We talk a bit about how do we address suspicion. And it's simple to say, but really hard to do. And that is simply trust. You have to somehow build trust with people, individually, institutionally, so that they believe that what you say is true. Well, that's the simple answer, but again, very hard to do when these days, lots of people are suspicious about virtually everything, including, as I said, religious and educational institutions. So this is going to be with us for a while, but we've got to be faithful. And here, Sister Damien, loving. Obligations only go so far. We really want to do what we do, care for creation out of love. But that means we need to know something about the world. We're going to more likely love something that we know about. So we have to become more ecologically literate. We need to get to know people who don't look like us. It's a long list of ways we need to become more familiar with the world, to love it the way that Laudato Si speaks about caring for creation.
Yeah, because I think love and truth are very connected, and in reality, and maybe not so much in the mind of people today. And we need to kind of bring that connection back, because the truest things are the things that are motivated by true love and sacrifice, right, for the other. The other thing I was thinking when you were talking, Steve, is that the need for dialogue, but true dialogue, and so something like this today, I just find this really exciting that we were able to put this together. And I really thank GBSU for putting it together. But dialogue where we actually really listen to the other person, just like we also want to listen to creation and what creation is saying to us. But can we listen to people who even disagree with us, but still be kind and learn from one another? And out of the dialogue, I do think sometimes a higher understanding occurs, not always, but a higher understanding, which is really the truth. But if we sit in our different camps and we don't really talk, so that would be dialogue between different religions, dialogue between different branches of science, dialogue between atheists and Christians and Jewish, so ecumenical dialogue too. And I think the truth can emerge out of that careful listening if we do it in a respectful way.
So Doug, the upshot is you got your work cut out for you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would echo, what you're saying, in terms of at the Ullman Center. I think one of the things that we're working on is helping institutions to become common good institutions, institutions for the common good institutions, go by the way, because, they can be trusted to be honest, to engage people with the truth, and to earn, that respect. And it needs to be hard earned. But what I like about this conversation is that we've named something that needs to be addressed. If we haven't named it as a church, as an evangelical community, and say it's an issue and that needs to be addressed, then we're not going to engage it. But I like the fact that your institution, the institutions we all represent, have named it, and we're going to work on something to change it.
Yeah.
I don't have all the answers, but we will work at it.
Yeah, fascinating. Steve, I'd like to ask you to kind of go back where I started this conversation today, and I'm just curious about whether you see a connection between Christian environmental theology, Christian environmental practice, and the non-Christian faith traditions of the indigenous peoples. Is there a nexus there, and is there a way we can learn from one another?
It's a great question, George. And actually, just last week in one of my classes, Earth and Ethics, we were discussing both Tibetan Buddhism and Islam, and readings from a wonderful book called Spirit and Nature, Why the Environment is a Religious Issue, an Interfaith Dialogue. I had students read a couple of chapters from that book, and we talked about the essay by Syed Hossein Nasser, who's a Muslim who's talking about the connections between Islam and environmental creation care, or the Dalai Lama. We watched a video of the Dalai Lama, read and discussed an essay of his where he's arguing from a Tibetan Buddhist point of view why people ought to be earth keepers, care for creation. And you mentioned the Adwa, the Potawatomi, some of the native indigenous people to this part of Michigan, but Chris could talk about the Maori approach, indigenous people to New Zealand, or the Guarani in Paraguay. My middle daughter spent 3.5 years with the United States Peace Corps in Paraguay after she graduated from college, and we went down to visit her, and she's fluent in Guarani in addition to Spanish. So not to romanticize indigenous people and their religion, but you find all over the world in virtually every religion resources for those people and the rest of us to care for creation, whether they're practical or more theoretical. I mean, there are lots of connections, and it gets back to mention the common good. That's argument number 7 on my list of 10. We have this common good called planet Earth and our mutual health. And regardless of our religious tradition, we all have good reasons, seems to me, to work together toward this common good of caring for our home planet. And we have a lot to learn from indigenous folk, many of whom they and their culture are invisible to most of us who are not part of those traditions. Again, I live in Ottawa with 2 T's county, but I'm guessing less than 10% of the people who live here know that Ottawa is a mangling of the Ottawa name of one of the groups of people who lived here long before the Europeans showed up. So we have a lot of work to do, I think, just to become aware of all the sorts of things, George, you mentioned at the very beginning of this session about learning about the people, indigenous people who occupied wherever we live in the world and what their culture was like and how they took care of their particular place in our home planet. A lot to learn there.
Yeah, I suppose my theology borders on heresy with pantheism, or at least panentheism. But it just seems to me like the spirituality of indigenous people, at least to the extent that I understand it and have read it or heard it, is so much closer to that connectivity with the rest of creation. We European moderns are so disconnected from nature, in a sense, that we've lost that sense of God's spirit in the created order. And I think there's much that we can learn from the indigenous faiths.
I completely agree, but it's incumbent upon people like me to point out to, say, Reform folk, that you can find verbatim text from John Calvin, the Protestant reformer died in 1564, who talks about the importance of the role of the Holy Spirit. And it sounds like panentheism. You just mentioned, God is in everything, not reduced to it, but everything is in God, panentheism. And it's right out of Calvin. But I'm guessing very few Reform folk are aware of that. The emphasis on the Holy Spirit, the neglected person of the Christian Trinity, who gets very little attention, that there's this sense of the Spirit permeates, says Calvin, is in and upholds everything. Without the Holy Spirit, nothing would exist. And so you see there are residences there within Orthodox Christian theology with much of what you would find if you were talking to some indigenous people.
Yeah.
And there's some resonance with that, even in the Catholic tradition. I think some distinctions would need to be made, and certainly in the Franciscan tradition, the idea that the footprints, so St. Bonaventure, the footprints of the Creator are in the creation all around us, speaking the language. So this whole idea of the grammar of creation.
Right.
So I think all of that relates to what you're saying, George. I think there's a lot of resonances there. Not a complete agreement perhaps, but there's a lot of resonance of what you're heading for, what you're longing for. So.
Well, one of the quotes I wrote down as I was listening to you, Sister Damien, was that creation points beyond itself to the Creator. That's a powerful statement for me to remember.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And let me pose. We're down to just within the next. I show 4 minutes here, and Sister Damien, I was so glad that you brought Laudato Si to us today, because I think it's one of the most important documents in the Christian faith around this whole question of creation care and climate protection. But Francis makes the important link in the encyclical between care for the environment and care for the most vulnerable of humans in the world. And I'd be happy if you could take just a minute or two to flesh that out a little bit more for us.
All right. Yeah. So that's a very strong theme throughout his whole pontificate, especially in Laudato Si, the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. They're interconnected. So Steve mentioned environmental racism. That's one way, very clear for all of us, that the poor live in neighborhoods that tend to be more polluted, and they don't have the resources to counter that or to clean that up. And so the pollution affects them disproportionately, right? So the cry of the earth through pollution is affecting the poor disproportionately and causing actually premature deaths, millions of them. We have the data to show this. I think the Pope also highlights the issue of water in a particular way, and the issue of environmental refugees, which is something I think touches our hearts. That so if the poor are involved in agriculture, fishing, forestry, and all of that is being affected by climate change, for example, this is actually, there are many, many environmental refugees who have to leave their land because they simply cannot make their living because of the environmental degradation, and in particular because of climate change. So he really laments that idea of environmental refugees. And then I think just the idea that if we don't listen to the cry of the poor, we really aren't going to be able to hear the cry of nature itself. And that's another, so it goes the other way too, that by listening to the cry of the poor, we better hear the cry of nature. By listening to the cry of the earth, we better hear the cry of the poor.
Either of the other panelists want to comment on that?
I just finished using a book in a class, Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor. That's the title of the book. And so I just want to say a hearty evangelical Protestant amen to what Damien just said. I mean, we tend to separate those issues, but they are truly interrelated, and we need to see it that way if we're going to make any progress.
Well, amen maybe is the way to wrap this session up. At the beginning,
Hallelujah too.
Hallelujah. I said at the beginning this was going to be a rich conversation, and little did I know how rich it would be, and how enriching it has been. And for me personally, just to get a chance to know the three of you better through this course of this past hour together. This has been a great gift, and I know we have other questions in the queue here from our attendees, but we're going to have to leave those for some other time. And I want to thank each of our panelists this afternoon, Steve Bouma-Prediger of Hope College, Sister Damien Savino of Aquinas College, and Mr. Chris Elisara of Duke Divinity School. So thank you each and each one. We appreciate it. And now I turn it back for the next hour to our friend Doug Kinchy. Doug? please take it away.
And thank you, George, for moderating this very informative and exciting panel. I just want to point out that this whole discussion will be available on our website in a few days for those who want to follow up on the rich discussion that took place. I also want to thank you for the shout out for interfaith dialogue. That's what we have discovered in our interfaith work, that it is not something that it brings us, takes us apart or waters down our faith. What we have discovered is the more we learn from others, the more our own faith is enriched and strengthened. And so it's an important part of the theme of the Kaufman Interfaith Institute. Also, since this is part of the tradition of science and religion, I would also point out that I think it was Galileo that said, we read the book of nature and we read the book of scripture, that we learn from both. And we're coming back to some old themes, theological themes, as well as some old scientific themes that are very important for what we're doing. So we're getting ready now for our next panel. And for that, I'm going to introduce the moderator for that. It's going to be Dr. Gail Hefner. She served as a professor at Calvin University and also as director of community engagement in the office of the provost. She co-founded and co-directed the Plaster Creek Stewards and has worked for more than a decade to address environmental justice as an integral part of the watershed research work in West Michigan. She's also worked and written on the environment and the connection to racism. Gail received her PhD from Michigan State University in Urban Studies and Resource Development. She's published widely on topics of climate leadership in communities of faith and in the topic of watershed restoration. She served on many boards, received awards and grants for her work on the watershed issues. She is currently Professor Emerita at Calvin University. It's a pleasure to introduce Gail and as the moderator for our next panel discussing how do we in practice promote environmental care. Gail, it's yours.
Thank you, Doug. It's good to be with all of you today. And I'm really grateful for the first panel and the rich discussion that was part of what we all heard just now. I am particularly struck by what was said near the end about the need to listen to both the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. And I think that's a perfect lead in for us as we begin the second panel. The first panel, the main thing they talked about is the motivation. Why should we care for the earth? Why should we care for creation? What's a Christian perspective on why to care for the earth? This second panel will focus more on the how. What are we doing? What specific things can we do to become involved in action to bring restoration and hope and healing to the brokenness that exists in the earth? And so it's my privilege to introduce our three panelists for the second panel. The first person will be Kyle Myers-Scott, and Kyle recently finished work as the National Organizer for Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, and his current position now is Vice President with the Evangelical Environmental Network, which is the parent organization. Second person will be Steve Mulder from Climate Witness Project. Steve has been doing work for a number of years with the Office of Social Justice in the Christian Reformed Church, and has been really involved with the Climate Witness Project. And we're really excited to have a chance for him to speak to us. And the third person is Dave Warners, who is a professor at Calvin, a professor of biology at Calvin University. He is my partner in crime in starting Plaster Creek Stewards, and he now is the director of Plaster Creek Stewards, so he'll talk about that as well. And I think we'll begin with each of them introducing themselves, saying more about the organization and work that they've been doing. And then we'll get into a conversation more about how any of you can become involved in the work that they're doing. So let's start with Kyle. If you'll begin and tell us more about you, Kyle, and the work that you're doing, that would be great.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Gail. And thank you to the previous panelists and to Steve and to Dave and to the Kaufman Institute for this opportunity. I'm thrilled to be a part of it. As Gail said, I'm Kyle Myers-Scott. I'm the Vice President of the Evangelical Environmental Network, which is a national organization really trying to do a pretty basic thing, which is to help Christians understand that our faith calls us to engage in the work of creation care, climate action, and loving the poor by loving the earth. So much of what we just heard on the previous panel gets at the roots of why we do what we do, because we believe that this is just part of what it means to follow Jesus faithfully, always, and especially in the 21st century in the face of runaway warming. We do this by engaging Christians, congregations across the country, in education opportunities, helping them understand what Scripture has to say about what God thinks of the world, about our responsibility toward the rest of the world and toward our neighbors, what the science is saying, what our study of creation is telling us is happening to God's world, and then what our faith calls us to do in response. So we are educating toward the end of mobilizing for action, because we believe the church has the potential to be the change agent, to reach the tipping point in the United States when it comes to addressing the threats of pollution and the threat of climate change in this country. Evangelical Christians, whether you may like it or not, continue to be a really potent political force in the United States. Exit polls were a little fuzzy this year because of all of mail-in balloting, but decent numbers have white evangelicals as about 17% of the general population. Their share is declining, but their share of the electorate remains at about 25 or 26% of all people who voted. This is a constituency that needs to be reached on this issue, not only because it's right down the center of their beliefs and their values, but because they have the potential to really move the ship when it comes to addressing this. We have lots of ways for people to get involved in the work that we're doing. A couple that I just want to highlight right here is our EEN Partners Program. Our Partners Program is a cohort model of intensive training that puts you in a small cohort of your peers through an intensive training course that happens online, where you get access to biblical teaching on what Scripture has to say about creation care, where you get insight into the latest scientific findings on pollution and climate change, where you get access to Organizing 101, tactics and techniques that work, where you get trained in messaging, how to be an effective messenger, especially to communities who may not be all that receptive to traditional messages around climate change and environmental care. And then you are supported and equipped as you go out and implemented a project of your designing, whether that's individually in your own life and in your home or in your congregation, or even nationally at the advocacy level. The second opportunity I want to point out is right now we have an opportunity to enact the most ambitious piece of climate legislation ever in our country's history, with the unveiling of President Biden's infrastructure package. There's going to be a lot of wrangling over what that actually looks like, but right now it is very, very strong on clean energy, infrastructure, on research and development, in drawdown of emissions. And it's very, very important that Christians engage in the conversation around that piece of legislation, and that lawmakers hear that evangelical Christians and Christians of all stripes are paying attention and want them to do this. So we have a petition right now called the Pro-Life Clean Jobs Petition. And if you're squeamish around the term pro-life, the way that we use it is very holistic. We understand Christians to be called to protect and defend the sanctity of all life, from birth, from natural conception to death, to natural death. And we believe that clean jobs is a way to do that, right? Clean jobs protects the sanctity and the dignity of human lives by participating in the economy in a way that doesn't pollute and doesn't harm people in adverse ways. And so we want to make sure our legislators hear us when we say, because we are called to defend life, we want to see you implement legislation that cleans up our economy and puts millions of people to work in family-sustaining clean jobs. And when you sign that petition, you get on our list so that you hear from us again in a couple of months. I'm going to tease this when we launch our Summer of Advocacy, where we are going to be offering lobbying training, for people, and then setting up meetings with your legislator for you, so that you can communicate directly to your member of Congress that you want to see this package get passed. And then finally, Gail mentioned Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, which is our youth engagement ministry. YECA has an advocates program, which is similar to the partners program. It's a cohort model for young people. So if you're a young person, 30 and under, or have a young person in your life that might be interested in this, you go through an on-demand online training module. And when you complete it, you receive a certificate and some goodies that get mailed to you. And then you get plugged in to a cohort of your peers, other advocates, and you meet once a month to encourage one another to learn. And then you're on the front lines of YECA's advocacy opportunities. So you are the first people to hear about opportunities to raise your voice and to really move the needle on climate change. I could go on, but I'm talked long enough. So I want to make sure to give Dave and Steve some time. So I'm pleased to be here and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Kyle. That's great. Let's turn now to Steve Mulder from the Climate Witness Project. Steve?
Thank you, Gail. It's just great to be here with all these friends and like-minded folks, like-hearted folks. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a theologian, so it's kind of good that I'm wedged between what I would consider a theologian and a scientist. I'm sort of a regular person. I've kind of late to this work in terms of doing the work. In a full-time way. I'm a lifelong lover of creation, but retired from about 35 years in the corporate world 5 years ago and got involved in the Climate Witness Project. So I want to tell you just a little bit about the background of the Climate Witness Project and then kind of what we're working on, really only because I want you to join us, frankly. So I'm going to rattle through a bunch of different things, hoping something will catch your interest. And if it does, you can get in contact with me and we can talk about how to join the Climate Witness Project. So the Climate Witness Project works at the congregational level, and we encourage congregations to create green teams or creation care teams or whatever they choose to call them, and then work in 4 areas. So these are our pillars, which are 2 of them are kind of my sister Damien's referenced sort of internal, and 2 are more external. So the 2 that are more internal are worship and education. So those are 2 pillars, and then the other 2 pillars are energy stewardship for the congregation, and then advocacy. So those are our 4 pillars. I wanted to give you some ideas about, or some of the things that we've done recently and what we're working on right now, so that if you're interested in joining us, it would be wonderful to have you. So in terms of worship, the way I think about this is we're trying to help churches sort of change hearts and minds, so that to kind of move away from a relationship with the creation, which is entirely out there. That's the creation is I'm not part of that. That's nature. I'm something different. Human beings are something different. Or nature is strictly something to extract resources from. So this is about changing hearts and minds in my mind. So one of the things that we're hoping to do this year is, at my church in particular, really celebrate the season of creation. So some congregations and some denominations have been doing this for a few years. It's about a month long, September 1 to October 4, in ordinary time in the liturgy.
Let's switch gears for a few minutes until Steve can get reconnected, and we'll switch and go to Dave Warner's. Let Dave speak, and then we'll come back and let Steve finish what he's saying. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave Warner's from Calvin University. Dave?
All right, thank you, Gail. I also just want to say how grateful I am to have been invited to be part of this panel, and grateful for the comments that were offered during the earlier conversation as well. I find this whole day very hopeful and encouraging, and a sign that good things are happening. So, and thank you everyone for joining in as well. In terms of introducing myself, I want to say that I grew up here in West Michigan, and I say that because this place, this landscape, I have a deep connection with it. And I've seen in the course of my lifetime a lot of changes that have happened to this landscape, many of which have not been for the good of the landscape and the good of the local ecology. And so I feel like I've got strong roots here. And a lot of the motivation for the things that I do comes out of those strong roots. When I came here back to West Michigan to begin teaching at Calvin in 1997, I was really interested in getting my students involved in the community by way of service learning. And that's when I ran into Gail Hefner, who was the director for Calvin Service Learning. One of the things that we were doing in my biology classes, especially my botany classes, was looking at the watershed that Calvin is situated within, which is the Plaster Creek watershed. And the more we learned about that watershed, the more we realized it's in really bad shape and it needs a lot of attention. And this recognition that the creek that drains the watershed that Calvin is located in, along with the fact that at Calvin, in the Reformed tradition of Christianity, we talk a lot about the importance of stewardship and taking care of creation, and that God cares so much for all of creation. That juxtaposition was really uncomfortable. And out of that uncomfortability arose this effort that Gail and I started called Plaster Creek Stewards, which was begun about 11 years ago. And Plaster Creek Stewards is a collaboration of Calvin University, faculty, staff, and students, working together with local schools, churches, and community partners to restore health and beauty back to the Plaster Creek watershed. A major problem with this creek is that it gets too much water when it rains. And so much of our efforts have been directed at trying to retain stormwater when it rains, retain it on the land itself. And we do that using native plants. So we're returning biodiversity back to the urban neighborhoods where biodiversity has really been pushed away. And through all these activities, trying to make the creek healthier and less of a threat to downstream communities. We do see our work as a direct manifestation of our faith. And our faith that Jesus' resurrection was an act of love for all of creation. And that as Christ's followers, as Christians, as Christ's ones, quite literally, we are called to be ambassadors of that same type of resurrection and called to be agents of resurrection and spread the good news to the whole creation. So addressing the broken relationships that are out there. Steve was just talking about, before he got cut off, the importance of recognizing that we're in relationship with the creation, not only with other people. It's curious, isn't it, that we can think about our relationship to a cherished family dog or a pet, but we don't think about a relationship to a creek or to even the deer that wander through the corridor of a creek. We need to expand the way we think, and a lot of indigenous people can teach us to do that, to sort of unlearn some of those Enlightenment principles that we are above nature, and to relearn the fact that we are dependent on nature. We're embedded within it. We're part of this joyful symphony that gives praise to the Creator. So our work, we really see our work as being housed within this concept of reconciliation ecology, of bringing people and the land back together again. I think I'll leave it at that and maybe go back to Steve. Welcome back, Steve.
Great.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Dave. Back to you, Steve Mulder.
Okay, sorry about that. So I was talking about the 4 pillars. So the first one was worship. The second one is education. And so we've done a lot of things, encouraged churches and congregations to do book studies, show films, but then also done things in West Michigan in a group. And one of the things we're doing right now is, we're not doing it, but we're helping the Wege Foundation support their speaker this year, who is Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who wrote this book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And I see heads nodding. This is just a wonderful book, and I so much appreciate Doug and George's comments about Indigenous folks, and also Dave's just now. At my church, we're trying to figure out, well, what does it mean that we're our church sits on Anishinaabe land, that people were here before us. What do we do with that? So this is really what Robin talks about, and she is a member of the Potawatomi Nation, so she's part of the 3 tribes or 3 fires group. So we're encouraging folks to take advantage of that digital or virtual speech or presentation by Robin Kimmerer, and that's going to be on the 27th of May, I believe, at 4 p.m. But what we're really hoping to do is, what can we do after that? How can we think about that? Is there something we can do in West Michigan more broadly, or maybe at the congregational level? What does that mean for us? How does that change our relationship, or even how does that change our relationship with those people? So then a third pillar is energy stewardship. And so this is usually the first thing that churches get involved in, partly because it's very easy. It's not that it's easy to do, but it's easy to talk about. It's not very political. Everybody wants to save money, so energy stewardship typically saves money too. And so it's helping churches figure out how to become more efficient. And really, what we're trying to do now is help them go solar. So we're working with the U.S. Green Buildings Council, National Wildlife Federation, and IPL to do some of that in West Michigan. So we do partner with lots of other organizations because we're just a small organization ourselves, and we want to, work together with our brothers and sisters who are doing this kind of work. And then the fourth pillar is advocacy. So we feel that individual action is very important. How I change my lifestyle, how my church changes how it operates. But also we need to influence policy. And so we're doing that at the city level, the county level, the state level, and the federal level. And we're doing lots of meetings with lots of legislators, the mayor, county commissioners. And I always say that the main message is just to show up, just to say that we're Christians who are concerned about this. We're concerned about the environment, we're concerned about the climate crisis. And we always go with some specific ask. This is the legislation we really want you to address, but really it's about building relationship and going back over and over again and saying, we're still here, we still think this is important, we really want you to work on this. So those are our four pillars: worship, education, energy stewardship, and advocacy. The nature of the project is to help congregations do that work. It did start as a Christian Reformed Church project, but now we have 20 different denominations involved. And we welcome you to join us. And what we would do is kind of try to help you establish a green team, or if you have one already, share resources with you, share what other congregations are doing so that you can become more effective. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Steve. I think a question that I'd love to hear each of you address at some point. The first panel talked a lot about the connection between knowing and doing, or the interior motivation leading to behaviors and actions outwardly. And I'd love to have each of you talk about what has worked well for your group or your initiative to get people involved, and give us some ideas of what has worked well with your work.
I'm happy to take a crack at that, Gail. Thanks for that question. It's really important because I think for a long time, environmentalists, environmental groups, climate activists thought if people just understand the facts, then they're going to change their behavior, right? If we can just get the information out there, that'll be enough. And we know from heaps and heaps of data and tons of anecdotal experience that hasn't worked, and it's not going to work. So we need to continue to find different ways of reaching people and inviting them into the work in ways that speak to them specifically. And that's a lot of what we try to do at EEN and at YECA, is to recognize that for a long, long time, evangelical Christians have not been a part of conversations around mainstream environmentalism and climate action. And I think there's plenty of blame to go around on all sides, including evangelicals who have opted out of that conversation. However, part of the reason is also because the way that this work is communicated doesn't particularly resonate with a lot of evangelical Christians around the country. And we've done deep dives into kind of the social science and the psychological research around this, and we've come to find that there are some principles of communication across the board that are necessary in order to reach people in a way that will actually bring them in and reach them in a way you want to reach them. And you need to do it in a way that affirms their existing identity. In other words, doesn't say who you are and the things you love about who you are wrong, or you need to change these things dramatically. It doesn't mean you can't call for shifts in practices and adjustments to lifestyle, but wholesale rejection of who somebody is a great way to turn them off immediately. It also needs to connect to their values. What are the things that motivate the people that you're trying to reach? It might not be the same values that someone who's active in the Sierra Club brings to climate action, but that doesn't mean that they can't make common cause with the person from Sierra Club in the work of moving toward drawing down emissions and mitigating and adapting to climate impacts. So affirming identities, tapping into existing values, and in the evangelical community, that's values like the authority of Scripture, drawing out scriptural principles to undergird the work that we're doing. A strong value we found with many evangelical Christians in the US is kids' health, protecting kids from pollution. So connecting the dots between fossil fuel pollution and human health impacts, which are myriad. As Sister Damien pointed out, Pope Francis makes clear in his encyclical. And then storytelling. Storytelling is so important. We try to teach people how to tell stories, and usually their own stories, because it's really hard to discredit the personal story of somebody you know and love and trust. Certainly a lot harder than it is to discredit an esoteric scientific paper written by a nameless, faceless scientist. So storytelling that's told as close to somebody as possible, whether that's a kid or a grandkid or a parent or a pastor. Trusted messengers are so important because it helps people see themselves in the work. They say, oh, you're doing this? Interesting. You're my Sunday school teacher. Tell me more about that. I trust you a whole lot more than I trust a press release from 350.org. So, tapping into those values and affirming people's identities, affirming who they are, and telling stories are really important tools. And then as you bring people along, we got to get better at cultivating joy and creating communities of belonging in this work. We know that anger can spark people to action, and frustration and guilt and blame, which I think the movement is really heavy on, can bring people in, but it's not a sustainable motivation. So as much as we can, cultivating communities of belonging, which is what we try to do in our partners program and our advocates program, creating communities and spaces where people can be together in community doing this work, where we can find joy and celebrate together, even as we grieve, which is central to this work too. So those are a few observations.
Thank you, Kyle.
Yeah, I would totally agree with what Kyle just said. I might say it slightly differently. I know we've learned that data is not particularly motivating and fear is not particularly motivating, unless you're trying to motivate somebody to despair, which we don't want to do. So, but one technique we've used a lot, and I think we got this from Catherine Hayhoe, is love. And Steve Prediger, Bouma referenced this, and so does Sister Damien. Just ask, what is it that you love? What do you cherish about, that may be under threat right now? And what you'll hear about is, the local environment, the camping trips with my family. Maybe it's love of my neighbor. Maybe it's the most vulnerable people in the world who are threatened by this. And very frequently it's love of my family, my kids, my grandkids. And so that speaks to me for sure. I see my grandkids and I want them to have a safe and verdant world for them to live in. So that sort of builds some common ground, when you have that kind of conversation and people share what they're concerned about. And then you can get into, well, what do we need to do then to protect these things that we love, these people that we love?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Steve. Dave?
Yeah, in the local work that we do in the Plaster Creek watershed, we have yet to meet someone from the watershed who likes the fact that the creek is really contaminated. Nobody wants it this way. So we don't have to convince people that this is a bad thing. But what people, the information that they're lacking is, what are the consequences of having such a contaminated stream? And it's known as the most polluted stream in West Michigan. And what can they do about it? Those are the two big things. So, you know, what are the consequences? We talk about upstream, downstream connections. We talk about the communities that are downstream that have to put up with the high levels of E. coli and the floodwaters. And when possible, we have people from upstream meet the people from downstream, or have schools form partnerships, or churches form partnerships. Then it's not just, oh, this community that has a name, but they get to know individual people who are affected by what happens in the upstream region. So making those personal connections has been really, really valuable and deeply meaningful. And then also, you know, these are things that we need to practice. And so we give opportunity to people to do things. And we always try to combine education with action. And, you know, on April 24, we're going to have a big tree planting blitz where we're going to have 3 different sites where people can plant trees. And we'll talk to them about the value of trees, and then also get them thinking about what's the space that you have some agency over, whether it's your own yard or your church grounds or the grounds where your kids go to school. And could those areas use some more trees? And then, you know, encourage them to take what they've learned and apply it elsewhere. So I think, you know, combining education with action is really important, and getting them in our local context here to think about upstream and downstream connections.
Thank you, Dave. A question that's come in from the participants is something I'd like to offer each of you to think about and then give some feedback. In terms of getting folks involved or taking action in your work, what have been the challenges and the successes? So give us some ideas that are more specific, that have been the challenges as well as the successes in the work that you've been involved in.
I think for me, before COVID of course has presented a whole unique set of challenges, especially because most of the work we do is by going into a congregation and doing a presentation and then talking to the folks all together in a room. Can't do that. So that's presented some problems. But I think the biggest challenge that we have engaging people in the long term, you know, we don't want to just have somebody sign up for, you know, just to sign a name on a piece of paper, but rather commit to doing some work over time. And the biggest issue is everybody is so busy. Everybody feels so overwhelmed already. And that's a hard thing to you know, you got some people who are just so busy with life, but then other people who are frankly busy is trying to survive. And so climate change becomes more of a theoretical issue. So it's very important to make it here and now, and to show how it's connected to all of the other issues of life. And I don't know. It'd be interesting to see what Dave and Kyle say about that too.
Yeah, I completely agree, Steve. I think that's a challenge for climate organizing across the board. Is climate change is such a big, unwieldy, intersectional issue, and it's so existential that it can be hard for people to sink their teeth into and easy for people to check out of. So that's certainly a challenge. And you know, the people who do care and want to do something, there's also apocalypse fatigue. How long can you be exposed to the headlines that are out there without being run down and defeated? So those are all challenges, I think, for any climate organizer. I think for our work, specifically trying to organize evangelical Christians around this, we have the added layer of difficulty, which is just the history of general suspicion around climate science in the evangelical church in the US. The data is out there to show that white evangelical Christians in the US are some of the least convinced of the science on climate change and most skeptical of proposed solutions. So there's kind of a baked in skepticism already in the community we're trying to reach. And there's lots of reasons for that. So that's certainly a challenge that we've faced. I think some of the successes that come to mind are from when we are able to gather together and to take action together. One is Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. In 2015, launched a campaign to influence the executive committee of the National Association of Evangelicals, which is the largest association of evangelicals in the US. Launched a campaign to influence them to ask them to adopt a position statement on creation care and climate change. To that point, they hadn't. And we collected several hundred letters to members of that committee. And there was one kind of holdout from a traditionally conservative denomination. And we were able to connect that member of the executive committee with a member of YECA who was also from that leader's denomination. And to hear that young person's story about why growing up in that denomination instilled in him the values that drive his passion for climate action today. And it really affected that leader. And in the end, he didn't vote in favor of the resolution, but he abstained, which cleared the way for its passage. And now the NAE, the largest group of evangelicals in the US, has a position on climate change, which calls Christians to do something about it. Another example that comes to mind is we had a lobby day in Washington, D.C. in 2017, where we brought about 100 people to D.C. to lobby members of Congress. And we brought about 20 or so young people into the chambers of then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to meet with his chief of staff. And the chief of staff asked, how many of you would consider yourself conservatives? and almost none of the young people raised their hand. And you could see the smirk on the chief of staff's face thinking, oh, this is just a Trojan horse. They're calling themselves evangelicals, but they're not our constituents. And then one after the other, young people in the room told him about how they grew up in conservative homes and still held many conservative values, but couldn't claim the party because they felt like it had left them behind on climate change. And that was really powerful to hear a couple dozen young people, young Christians in the Senate Majority Leader's chamber speaking that kind of truth to power. Was really inspiring and really exciting.
Dave, do you have anything you want to add?
I was really enjoying just listening to Steve and Kyle. But as I think about this, right, challenges and successes, I think in our work, one challenge we have is people, yes, they're so busy and they want to be convinced that what they're doing is going to make a difference. I think that's one thing. So overcoming this sense that if my activity is not going to change things, then I'm not going to do it type thing. And, it's maybe easier to try to make that case because our watershed is a pretty, small area. The creek is not the Grand River. And yet, even if they get a rain garden in their yard that captures stormwater runoff, they could look at that and say, this is not going to change the creek. This is just holding my water back, but the creek is not going to be benefited. So I think trying to overcome that hesitancy is a challenge for us. And one way that I think we do address it is to don't do something because you think it's going to make a difference. Do something because it's part of your faithful walk as a Christian. We don't love our neighbor because we think it's going to change the course of human history. We love our neighbor because it's consistent with our beliefs. And we care for the creation because God cares for the creation, and Christ died for the creation. So if we can, redefine these activities as being part of their faith journey, as part of their expression of their Christianity, I think that can motivate people. And we also remind them that great movements always start with individuals, and then the momentum builds. So that, I think that's one challenge and one way that we have addressed it. One other one I'll just quickly mention is aesthetics for us. To put in a native plant rain garden in your yard when all your neighbors have beautiful turf grass can be a challenge to the monoculture in your neighborhood. And yet I think that type of landscape really needs to be questioned. How is that good for the creation when it's dependent on so many chemicals and it's so low in terms of diversity? So I think questioning that, but it's going against the grain. But I think that aesthetic does need to be questioned. And the more of these gardens and bioswales that we have in the urban area, the easier it is for the next one to get put in. So I think we're gaining in that area too.
Thank you,
Can I
Dave.
just say one? Can I say one more thing, Gail?
Sure.
In terms of success, I think what we really try to do is, encourage church congregations to have these green teams, because that's the place where you can foster and nourish hope and love and joy, as Kyle said. So it's sometimes, I mean, if you're looking at it just as an individual, what can I do? It can be so overwhelming, and my little piece is so tiny. But if I'm working with a group of people, I can have fun with it. I can be loving with each other. We can talk about different aspects of it, and I can focus on the thing that I find most interesting, which maybe is advocacy, and somebody else can focus on planting native plants on the church property if that's what they're interested in, and we can all kind of find our niche that way, and yet be a part of a bigger group of people.
Thank you, Steve. One of the things that has been in my mind the whole time we've been talking is it's obvious to me that all of us on this panel are white. We come from a European background. We are people of privilege, and we are aware, or at least have initial understandings of the disparity that exists with communities of color that are living in our community. And I'd like us to think about, how do we in our work begin to listen to the voices of color leaders, submit ourselves to them, to really engage in meaningful partnership where there's mutual learning and really careful listening. White people, European influenced people, tend to view human beings as wanting to find control and control over nature, control over the natural world. Indigenous people, that's a completely foreign idea to them. And so there are lots of assumptions that, or presuppositions, or whatever the word you want to use, that we as white people unconsciously have gotten hold of, that it's part of the way we live. How do we decenter that? How do we begin to listen to other voices and submit ourselves to the strengths and gifts and offerings that they have, their leadership? So I'm wanting each of you to sort of think about and talk about how in your work are you beginning to answer those kinds of questions. And I don't know who wants to start, but I think it's important that we think about these things. Anybody want to take it first?
Maybe I'll start out here. It's such an important question. And because environmental degradation is not played out equally across the landscape, there are certain communities that have to bear the brunt of it. And there are other communities that contribute the most. Climate change is certainly an example of that. One of the things that we've done with the Plaster Creek Stewards is we've developed a land acknowledgement statement, and we've developed an anti-racism statement that are posted right there on our website. And I'm also working with a group at Calvin to do the same for our institution. But we did that as as our own watershed organization. And we took a lot of time and consideration in developing those two statements. We have weekly meetings with the leadership team of Plaster Creek Stewards, and every week we talk about how have we seen white privilege play out in our lives this week. So that's something to help us keep us sensitized to the fact that we do have privilege and not everybody does. And then, how do you listen to voices of those that are most affected? You need to find them. You need to develop relationships with them, and then humble ourselves, which is kind of hard for academics to do. I mean, we're trained to think that we've got the answers, and we just have to really come to terms with issues like environmental racism. We don't have the answers, and we need to listen to the people who are most affected, because they do. They know what it's like, and they can teach us.
Yeah, Gail, thanks for the question. I really appreciate it, and it's so important for us to ask and answer and grapple with. Just a few thoughts. YECA has drafted and posted a commitment to anti-racism as well on our website, which has concrete commitments embedded in it about what YECA intends to do to do exactly what you propose, Gail, to get to know leaders of color in this movement, to put ourselves under their leadership, under their authority, to become accountable to them. And we recognize it is just a beginning. And that as we build relationships with Black, Indigenous, other folks of color leading this movement, we are going to have more of our blinders taken off, more of our blind spots exposed, so that we can refine those commitments and have a better understanding of how to be in relationship and solidarity with those leaders. One of those commitments for YECA for the last several years has been to be very intentional about bringing on people of color to the National Steering Committee, so that the leadership of the organization not only reflects the actual makeup of the evangelical community in the US, but overrepresents people of color because they are so often from communities who are most affected, and they are the voices who are least heard and need to be heard the most. EEN is trying to do the same at the board level as well. But again, a lot of that has to come from authentic relationship in order to avoid tokenism. And so, as Dave said, finding leaders in their spaces, going to their spaces. So something we try to do is just show up to environmental justice events that are being led by Black, Indigenous, other leaders of color, and just be there, show up to their stuff, and don't talk, just listen, watch and learn, introduce yourself, share, why you came, some of the work you're doing, express a commitment to wanting to build a relationship. That's really how it happens, and it's slow. And we are just at the beginning of it, but we're committed to doing more because it's so important. It has to happen.
Yeah, I can't really add a lot to that. I think Kyle said it very well. The Planet Women's Project has been pretty intentional about trying to find more women and people of color to take leadership roles. But our biggest challenge is finding churches that are largely of color and engaging them in the work, and having them really join into the project. I'm sure it's a long-term thing. It's about building trust and building relationships before saying, hey, quickly join us. We want you to do this. So we're working on that. And I don't think we've done a particularly great job so far, but we're working on it.
Thank
Steve,
you.
I appreciate you pointing that out. I think it's a really important historical reality, especially in the environmental movement, of tokenizing and exploiting marginalized communities. And one of the ways that looks like is inviting communities experiencing environmental injustice or minority communities, inviting them to your stuff without giving them a seat at the table at the beginning to help shape and plan it, or even to say, no, this is a bad idea. This is what we need to do. And I think that's a reality in the movement that we need to recognize and repent of, because it's such a common practice of exploitation that it almost goes unnoticed, but really needs to be recognized that so often environmental organizations that have been historically white-led want to slap on the diversity on the back end and at least have the picture, the image of diverse inclusion, when in fact it's exploitative. The opposite of that is doing the hard work of showing up first, letting other leaders lead, having a truly equitable space where everybody can bring their ideas and plan together from the very beginning.
Your guys' comments there made me think too that when we do education is to tell the truth. So for us, it's not simply a creek that's become polluted. It's a creek that basically white people have contaminated. It was a healthy creek for thousands of years when there were lots of people living in West Michigan. And it didn't become a health hazard to people downstream until after European immigrants settled in this area and started changing the landscape. And that's the truth. It's a painful truth but it's the truth that needs to be told when we talk about the problems of this creek. And it's also, the truth is that it doesn't affect everybody in West Michigan equally. It affects the lower income communities of color in the downstream reaches of the watershed much more than it does the communities in the upstream reaches. So I think telling the truth, even bringing up the term environmental racism, environmental injustice, the more we can incorporate that into our educational presentations, the better.
It's almost as if there's not recognition of the problem and we don't tell the truth and admit honestly our complicity in causing the problems, we can't really be about restoration and change. You want deep change, and that requires an honest acknowledgement of our complicity and what has happened.
Yeah.
Before we run out of time, there's been a question from the audience that I want to let each of you answer, and that is, what's a good starting point for someone who is inspired by what they've heard today and looking to make a first step? And so if each of you could just give one idea, and then we need to probably be done fairly quickly, but each of you say, what's one step that could be taken if someone wants to get involved?
Well, the one step I would recommend is to talk to me about starting a dream team at your church or your congregation if you're a member of the congregation. If you're not a member of a congregation, that's fine too. You can become a Climate Witness Project partner, but really the work is done at the congregational level. So if you're interested in trying to make something like that happen in your congregation, I'd love to talk to you about it.
Okay, thank you.
Myself, I would say one thing. I'm a botanist, so I would say plant some native plants in your yard.
Yeah.
It's magical because the pollinators show up and the birds come, and it's a wonderful way to learn and to get reconnected back to the landscape that was here before it was so drastically converted to urban spaces.
Another thing related, Dave, is that people could join for the April 24 Plaster Creek Stewards event. That's the information's on the website for that. Okay, Kyle?
I was just going to say, my wife and I just mulched our native section of our backyard that we put in a couple years ago. It's my favorite part of our yard. So a hearty second to that. But the first step that I often share with people when I give presentations or talk about this feels really small, actually. And like Dave said, can feel insignificant, but actually research shows it's one of the most important things we can do because it's not happening nearly enough, and that's talk about it. Just talk about it with your friends, with your family. The Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication has identified what they call the spiral of silence around climate change in US society, which is that the vast majority of people are hearing about climate change talked about by someone they know vanishingly infrequently. So we need to talk about it. It can be uncomfortable, but again, you don't have to be an expert on the science to talk about it. Don't talk about the science if you don't want to. All you have to do is share your own story. You could even just share that you participated in this event today, and what about this event inspired you, and what did it make you think about in terms of what Steve shared, what you care about, what you cherish, what you love. How did it connect to something you love and cherish, and what's it doing for you? You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to share your experience, and that gives other people permission to have their own experience and to share it too. And it's only until we get better at talking about it and more people are talking about it then that spiral of silence is going to break and we can actually start working together.
I want to piggyback on what you're saying, Kyle. I think it's really important for us all to be curious. And how do we keep being open and learning and asking questions and submitting ourselves to others? That's also a first step that could be taken. Yeah. So thank you all. Each one of you have offered great ideas and good things for us all to think about. I want to thank Doug and Grand Valley and the Kauffman Institute for this chance to have the panel today. And we're going to turn it back over to Doug, who'll do some final closing remarks. Doug?
Thank you, Gail, and for another really exciting panel. I'm just so excited to hear all the comments that have been made. I want to point out this will all be available on our website in a few days after we get it edited a bit. But you've given so many wonderful insights. Just picking up on Kyle's recent comment about talk about it. Catherine Hayhoe's TED Talk that's gone to millions she said that's the most important thing you can do is talk about it. She was, of course, the Calvin January speaker this year. And if you want some more inspiration, just Google Catherine Hayhoe, Hawhoe. She's been recently appointed the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy. But she really is an exciting speaker in terms of what we need to be doing. I want to thank Gail Hefner and George for moderating our two panels. It's done a really great job, and for all the panelists, it's been a really wonderful experience, and we want to build on this. We'll be watching our website, interfaithunderstanding.org, because we do want to build some book groups and some other activities that are going to come out of the activities of our Grand Dialogue, which takes place this week. Also, next Sunday at the same time, 2 o'clock, we will be hearing about the Interfaith Imperatives. We will be hearing from Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Native American, secular, and additional Christian insights on not only why do we do this, but what are some of the practical steps that can be taken. And then in the 3 days leading up to Earth Day, there will be 6 different workshops available. Again, our website will take you to any of those. So also I want to ask those that have been participating in our audience to also take a few minutes to complete our survey. It's available is at the chat, or we'll be sending you an email also to remind you to do that. And then also we have a weekly newsletter that comes out every Tuesday. Interfaith Insights included in that, which is reprinted by the Grand Rapids Press each Thursday. But that's a good source for the other activities that we're doing. Also, you can check us out on social media at Kaufman Interfaith Institute or at GR Interfaith. So another thing first step you can do is get involved in what we're doing. The earlier panel said that these are global issues, and it requires people from all faith traditions to weigh in on it and be part of the conversation. And the wonderful thing about interfaith that some people don't understand is that it doesn't water down our faith. Almost everybody that I've been involved with for the last 12 years has discovered, as you learn from people who are not like you, you learn to make your own faith commitment even deeper. It's a deepening experience. It's not a watering down experience. So we invite you all to be part of that, starting with next Sunday afternoon at 2. And again, a big thank you to our panelists and to our moderators for what's been a very useful and productive first step in our Grand Dialogue this year. Thank you all, and goodbye.